Catherine A. Epstein teaches courses in history and European studies here at Amherst, with a focus on Europe in the 20th century. She holds degrees from Brown University, the London School of Economics, and Harvard. She will be speaking to you today about the intriguing and perhaps surprising conclusions she has drawn from her research for the first English language biography of Arthur Greiser, a regional Nazi Party leader who oversaw a massive ethnic cleansing of Polish and Jewish people in Western Poland. Please join me in welcoming Professor Catherine Epstein.
All right, thank you very much for coming. You've come on a very dreary morning to hear about a dreary topic, but that was your choice. The book that I'm just completing this summer is called Model Nazi, Arthur Greiser and the Nazi Occupation of Western Poland. Now, why am I writing a biography of Arthur Greiser? Patricia Allen said this will be the first biography in English. Actually, it will be the only biography of Greiser except for a very short one in Polish. In any event, what's important about Greiser to me is that he shows a side of the Nazi regime that is not always so emphasized, especially in the United States. The Nazis, in the end, were about a lot more than just the Holocaust. In the end, what they wanted to do was to Germanize all of Eastern Europe. They planned on a total demographic reordering of Eastern Europe, a general plan that the Nazis came up with in 1942, planned that in the next 20 years, some 31 million persons, mostly Slavs, were to be murdered or deported. So this was ethnic cleansing on a much grander scale than even the Holocaust. Now, most of these plans did not, in fact, take place, other than the Holocaust. However, Greiser ruled over one part of Western Poland called the Warthegau, and this area actually did see many of these demographic experiments. So you could say that this is the one area where some of these most fantastic Nazi plans actually were carried out. During the interwar period, the Warthegau had been Poland. Some of you have a handout. I had no idea so many people were going to be coming. And you'll see a map. And what the Warthegau is, I believe more of these handouts are being made right now. The Warthegau is an area just east of really Berlin. So the capital of the Warthegau is a place called Posen, or today it's Poznan. That is less than a 3-hour train ride from Berlin today. So we're talking about an area that was very close to Germany proper. It had belonged to Germany prior to 1914 or prior to 1919, but during the interwar period, it became part of Poland. Now, what's important about this is that Greiser grew up in this area that became the Warthegau as a child. So he grew up in the German-Polish borderlands area, and ultimately, with the end of World War I, he and his family had to leave the area because it became part of interwar Poland. In 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland, Hitler decided to put Greiser in charge of this area, not least because Greiser had grown up there. Greiser was known as a quote-unquote child of the East, and Hitler assumed, correctly, that Greiser would carry out so-called right policies for this area. Now, the Warthegau was an area that had 5 million inhabitants altogether. Of those, 4.2 million were Poles, about 400,000 were Jews, and only about 300,000 were Germans. So that was the problem as far as Greiser was concerned. How was he going to make an area with just 300,000 Germans into a real sort of blossoming German territory? All right, so when he gets to the Warthegau, Greiser immediately proclaims Germanization as his main mission. And what Germanization entails is, again, a broader program than just the Holocaust. It's about the Germanization of the people and the land. It's about the ethnic cleansing of Poles. And it's about the final solution. Now, one of the things that I really want to emphasize is the interconnections also between all of these policies. This was one overarching sort of policy that Greiser had, and I'm going to run through them, but also explain the connections between them. All right, the Germanization of the people and the land. Greiser introduced policies that are really a primer for ethnic cleansing. Immediately, all Polish signs and inscriptions were removed. This went so far as removing names from Polish names from gravestones. Cities, towns, villages, streets were all given German names. There was the creation or the renovation of many institutions, German institutions now, a German theater, a German university, German libraries, German museums, German castle, and so on and so forth. Germanization also meant the renovation and building of new apartments and homes. There was a widespread sense that if Germans did not feel comfortable in the Warthegau, they would not stay. And so the idea was, you'd want to attract Germans to this area, in part through good living quarters. Some Germanization measures were seemingly trivial, but they are nonetheless telling. For example, in Posen, a government department was called Beauty of Living, and it focused on the creation of a German living culture or German interior design. And it insisted on the removal of all Polish kitsch and the substitution of furniture and cutlery with so-called German good taste. For the Warthegau, conditions, for example, people in this department suggested that for kitchen designs, cabinets should not have too many open cupboards. The cupboard should be easily locked. Why might that be the case? Anyone want to take a stab at it? All right, so the reason why is because you didn't want to have your pilfering Polish maid take all that food. So the idea was that if you had the right furniture for this area, it would match the conditions of the area. Germanization also involved attempts to alter the climate. There was a sense that there was too little greenery in the Warthegau, that this was essentially the beginning of the Asian steppe. Germans have a deep belief in sort of the value of forests and oak trees and bushes and greenery. And so a vast reforestation program was planned. Greiser also planned the largest reservoir in the world. These plans were begun, some reforestation took place, but that reservoir was never actually built. But the point here is, again, the extent of planning. The extent of the planning for Germanization was really quite extraordinary. Now, the most important form of Germanization, though, was actually the resettlement of ethnic Germans into the Warthegau. What Greiser intended was a wholesale changeover of the population. Altogether, more than 500,000 ethnic Germans were actually brought to the Warthegau. These ethnic Germans came from various parts of the Soviet Union or Soviet-occupied Poland before Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. Some of the ethnic Germans who came in were highly educated ethnic Germans from the Baltic countries, but most of these resettlers, these ethnic German resettlers who came in, were actually farmers, small-scale farmers. And the idea was to make the Warthegau, which was a very heavily agrarian area, essentially a human bulwark against Poles. And so the idea was you would bring in all of these German peasant families and create a sort of utopia of German smallholder farmers, which is what Nazis thought was the appropriate sort of agrarian organization. So you can imagine what this must have involved. Hundreds of thousands of people had to trek, often hundreds of miles, in order to get to the Warthegau. Once they came to the Warthegau, jobs had to be found for them, homes had to be found for them, farms had to be found for them. In many cases, these ethnic Germans actually languished in so-called temporary camps for a very long time, but large numbers really were resettled. So this, of course, brings me to the second part of Germanization, namely anti-Polish measures. Greiser viewed the Poles as the major threat to Germanization in this area, again, because of the demographics. In the fall of 1939, about 10,000 members of the Polish intelligentsia were simply murdered. This was not actually Greiser's policy. That particular policy came from Berlin. Thereafter, however, the idea was to deport the population, the Polish population, to the east. And again, this was largely so as to make room for all of those resettlers. The Poles were rounded up and forced to leave apartments and farms. Usually what happened was that, the morning of a resettlement, a truck would drive up to a Polish farm or a Polish village and say, everyone has 20 minutes, gather your most important possessions and leave everything else, okay? Then Poles were allowed to essentially take, I believe, about 50 pounds of goods and got on the trucks, were taken to a transportation center. Meanwhile, crews of Germans came in and cleaned the apartments and the homes and the farms so as to supposedly make them more or less ready for the incoming Germans. And later that afternoon, a German family would come in and use the dishes, the bedding, the sheets, and everything else of the Polish family that had just been deported. In the end, about 270,000 Poles were deported from the Warthegau between 1939 and 1941. Many others were forced to Germany proper to do forced labor over the next few years. Now, you might ask, why were so many Poles deported and not Jews? I'll get to the Jews in a second, but the reason why the Poles were actually the initial targets of deportation had to do with the fact that they had those farms, and there were many more of them. So because they were the ones on the farms that the Germans wanted, Poles became the main and initial target of the deportations. Now, not all Poles could obviously be deported, or not as quickly as Greiser wanted. And so for those that remained, a very serious system of discrimination was set up. For example, in September of 1940, all property of Poles and Jews was confiscated. Poles didn't have either German or Polish citizenship. They were essentially stateless, so-called protected subjects. As of 1942, there was a special criminal law for Poles and Jews that saw much more draconian punishments than those for Germans. In many ways, the Warthegau saw a real apartheid regime. What Greiser did was he introduced a so-called ethnic German registry, and everyone who was German had to register and get an identification card saying that he or she was German. That was valuable to Greiser's regime because it meant that everyone else who didn't have that identification card was Polish or Jewish. If you were Polish and you didn't have that ethnic German identity card, it meant that you were a second-class subject in every possible way. In some cases, the apartheid measures against Poles mimicked policies against Jews, but just to give you a sense, there were separate schools, separate park benches, separate restaurants for Poles. Poles were not permitted to use some forms of public transportation. They were not allowed to use express trains. They were not allowed to use certain tram lines, particularly during commuter hours. Poles were not permitted to go to museums. They were not permitted to go to concerts. They were not permitted to go to theater productions. Poles were not permitted to own cameras. They were not permitted to own records or record players, and a host of other goods, everything from binoculars to skis. Poles had lower rations. At various times, they were not permitted to buy wheat products at all, so no cake made out of wheat. No butter. Poles were not permitted to buy butter. They had to make do with margarine. Poles were subject to curfews. Polish doctors couldn't treat German patients. Poles were supposed to greet Germans, give some sort of a salute to Germans, especially in uniforms. This is one thing that the Poles just said, forget it, and they actually got away with it because the Germans thought it's too much trouble to force the Poles to quote-unquote greet us. One thing that was interesting about Poles was that they did not have to wear an identifying marker. So unlike Jews who much earlier than in Nazi Germany proper had to wear a Star of David already in December of 1939 in the Warthegau, but only in 1941 in Germany proper, the Germans never came up with a regulation that Poles had to wear an identifying marker. Anyone have a sense of why that might have been? What might that marker have done? Unified the Poles, or what it would have done was shown just how ubiquitous the Polish population was. And the Germans didn't want to have, walking symbols every day reminding them of how much of the population was still not German. Greiser actually would have preferred to have gone even farther. He was quite interested in the biological destruction of the Polish population. He was very eager to limit Poles having children. In 1941, he raised the marriage ages, so Polish men could only marry at age 28 and Polish women at age 25. What the Poles did was they just had illegitimate children, which is not what the Nazis expected, but that's what the Poles did. Greiser also worked with Heinrich Himmler, the real architect of the final solution, to Germanize so-called racially valuable Polish orphans. So, Polish children who seemed to have good character traits, who perhaps had a German ancestor somewhere along the way, were sort of taken from orphanages and placed in German families. This was a real problem for the children involved because many of them lost all identifying papers and everything and could later never find their real families. The numbers about how many kids were involved with this ranged from 300 to 12,000, so it wasn't a huge number of people. But again, it was another attempt that Greiser made to, ethnically cleanse the Polish population. In perhaps the most dramatic plan that Greiser had, he proposed the murder of 35,000 Poles sick with tuberculosis. He wrote to Himmler about this, asked Himmler whether this couldn't be done. Himmler originally thought, well, it could be okay, but Himmler talked with other people sort of in the higher Nazi hierarchy, and it was decided that for public relations reasons, this was not a good idea to subject Poles with tuberculosis to murder. So Greiser was actually told, no, he couldn't do that. Now, the Poles at some level did pose a great dilemma for Greiser, though, and that was that he desperately needed them as workers, but again, they stood in the way of Germanization. And this is what brings me now to the final solution in the Warthegau. You might have gathered from now correctly that Greiser was much more passionate in his hatred of Poles than he was in his hatred of Jews. He was anti-Semitic, like many Nazis, but that was not his sort of animating motive in terms of carrying out all of these Germanization policies. Nonetheless, in the Warthegau, the ethnic cleansing of Jewish culture took place, as well as the murder of Jews. In terms of the ethnic cleansing, a striking case of that can still be seen today. The Nazis turned the main synagogue in Posen into a swimming pool. Greiser supported the project. He made the funds available to turn the synagogue into the swimming pool. He was even present at the first meet that took place in the swimming pool. Today, if you go to that synagogue, it is still a swimming pool. It's a 25-meter pool. A diving board is right where the bima should be. And again, this was a little atypical of the ethnic cleansing of Jewish culture that took place, but most other sites of Jewish culture were destroyed in various ways. So, schools, ritual bathhouses, cemeteries were used for other purposes. Cemetery stones were simply ground up and used for roads, and so on and so forth. The Warthegau has come to assume a very important part in the history of the Holocaust because the second largest ghetto in all of Nazi-occupied Europe was located there. This is what you might know as the Łódź Ghetto, the Lodz Ghetto, the Litzmannstadt Ghetto. It's all the same thing, depends on how you pronounce it. But again, this is the second largest ghetto after the ghetto in Warsaw. And it had about 160,000 inhabitants. Now, Greiser came to view the Jews very instrumentally. As far as he was concerned, if Jews could help in Germanization, he was quite willing to keep them alive. If, however, they could not help in Germanization, if they were quote-unquote incapable of work, then he wanted them murdered, which I'll explain in a minute. The Litzmannstadt ghetto was forced to pay for its upkeep. Jews there had to work in order to produce enough goods, largely textile goods, in order to get enough money to buy food at outrageous prices from the Germans. Now, the ghetto was actually only briefly profitable, but it appears that Greiser and many other Nazi authorities thought that the ghetto was actually quite profitable and that a large amount of money could be secured by exploiting Jews in the ghetto. The way that this worked was that the companies who gave contracts for work in the ghetto, they had to pay regular wages for the Jews doing that work. But the Jews, of course, didn't get that money. The Jewish community in the ghetto got a small amount of that money, and the rest of it was given to the ghetto authority and ultimately ended up in a bank account that Greiser personally controlled. Okay, so there's a direct link between the exploitation of Jews in the ghetto and in work camps that took place around the Gau, and Greiser getting the profits that he could then use for other Germanization projects. Now, I just mentioned Jews that worked in work camps that dotted the Gau. Roughly 40,000 Jews were working in various work camps in the years 1941 through 1943. What were these Jews doing? Essentially, what they were doing was building those Germanization projects, essentially infrastructural projects for whom there weren't other workers to do the job. So, many Jews worked on a highway that was being constructed from Germany, the city of Frankfurt-Oder, to Posen. Virtually all street and road improvement work in the Gau was done by Jews. Jews laid down new train tracks. They laid down new sewage systems. In Posen, the city itself, they rebuilt the cemetery. They built a zoo. They built artificial lakes. They were involved in afforestation projects. And in all these different ways, they aimed to make the city look more German. So, Jews were essential for making Germanization projects happen. Greiser is actually on record for saying he was glad that he had Jews in his Gau because they could do work that no one else could do. Because everyone else was busy with farming or the other activities that needed to be done in his territory. Now, while the Jews who were capable, quote-unquote capable of working, were kept alive, the first mass gassings of Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe also took place under Greiser's aegis. This happened in December of 1941. Already then, Greiser initiated an extermination camp that is the Chelmno extermination camp that was also located in his Gau. Now, why was Greiser the first? Why did the first mass gassings take place there? This was actually quite related to the perceived population pressures in the Gau. So I mentioned that there was, a large influx of ethnic German resettlers. After March of 1941, Poles could no longer be deported to the east because soldiers were being pushed to the east on those trains that would have taken Poles in order to prepare for the invasion of the Soviet Union. So what happened in the Warthegau was, or as Gau authorities perceived it, was that there were a lot of population pressures sort of in the Gau. There were all these ethnic Germans, there were all these Poles, and then there were all these Jews, and from the sort of Gau authorities' perspective, it wasn't clear what should be done. Then, in September of 1941, Himmler sent a telegram to Greiser saying, we're going to send you 60,000 Jews from the West, deal with them. Put them in the Litzmannstadt ghetto and deal with them. And Greiser knew immediately that he had a problem on his hands in the sense that the people in Litzmannstadt did not want these Jews. They felt it would be impossible and so on and so forth. So Greiser first managed to lower the number of Jews coming from the West so that only 20,000 would come. And then he apparently made a deal with sort of Himmler, to the effect that if he took those 20,000 Jews, he would then be able to engage in special treatment against 100,000 other Jews. And that special treatment was, of course, a euphemism for murder, and that's why then, immediately after this agreement was made, the Chelmno extermination camp was constructed and within a few months was also in operation. So again, December 1941 is when you have the first mass gassings of Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe, all of which is before the famous Wannsee Conference in January of 1942. Okay. Now, Greiser, of course, like other Nazi authorities in other parts of Europe, also profited from Jews' death. When the Jews went to their deaths, they obviously, or in most cases, didn't know that they were going to their deaths. They took a lot of valuables along with them to the extent that they still had them. And so at Chelmno extermination camp, there was a huge sorting operation that took place. And there, large amounts of personal effects were taken from Jews. And again, all of the money made off of the proceeds from those objects went into this same account of Greisers that Greiser had personal control over. Let's see. Because of Greiser's belief that the Litzmannstadt ghetto was actually quite profitable, the Litzmannstadt ghetto was open much longer than any other ghetto in Nazi-occupied Europe. The Litzmannstadt ghetto was only closed down in August of 1944. That's about a year and a half after the Warsaw ghetto uprising. It's much later than any other place. And again, this seems to be very related to Greiser's aim of exploiting those Jews in the ghetto for as long as possible. In the end, Himmler just insisted that the Lodz ghetto the Litzmannstadt ghetto had to be eradicated, and so it was eradicated in August of 1944. It's interesting, though, had the Soviet armies marched in a little bit more quickly, 60 or 70,000 Jews were still alive in that area in August of 1944, and they could have perhaps been saved had Soviet armies taken a different route. Okay, now, I want to underscore that after all these measures, which are sort of extraordinary, in the end, it's remarkable how futile this ethnic cleansing project was. In March of 1944, Greiser informed Hitler and Himmler that the Warthegau had 1 million Germans. But that still meant that the Warthegau was overwhelmingly Polish. about 75% of the population in 1944 was still Polish. After all the murders, roughly 160,000 Jews were murdered. The others that I mentioned at the outset of those 400,000, many of them had fled eastwards already in the fall of 1939 or the early winter of 1940. So barely a quarter of the population in 1944 was German. Okay, now what I'm going to do is preempt a couple of questions from you guys. And the first question is, why did Greiser do what he did? And to this I have a sort of two-part answer. There's now, if you sort of look at research on Nazi perpetrators, there is a pretty clear consensus that there is no single motive that animated Nazi perpetrators. There is also, despite decades of research for the Nazi personality, what is the Nazi personality, it's pretty clear that any search for a Nazi personality is completely elusive. So instead, what appears to be going on is that the Nazi movement was actually very capacious, and so many people could find a home in the Nazi movement with very different sort of animating motives. Some were anti-Semites, some were simply sadists, some had this or that reason for getting into the Nazis in the first place. But what some recent research has underscored is that many perpetrators actually came from borderlands regions, and that these people really wanted to see Germany return to its former glory before 1918 or 1914. They felt like, the World War I defeat, the Treaty of Versailles, all that had been completely disastrous for Germany, and they were absolutely bent on sort of recapturing German glory, German national honor, and so on and so forth. Michael Mann, who is a sociologist at UCLA, has argued that the origins of mass murder lay substantially in embittered ethnic imperial revisionism. In other words, that large numbers of perpetrators came from areas that were threatened, that were lost, that somehow the ethnic future was not that clear. And of course, Greiser fits nicely into this interpretation. Interestingly, in the 1930s, Greiser had a love affair that was really quite a scandal. He divorced his wife and insisted on having this hot and heavy relationship with this professional pianist, Maria. I think if you have the handout, there's a picture of her. Not a very good picture of her. But what he writes in his love letters is something to the effect of, "Oh, Maria, I have to have you. You are the way that I can make Germany great again. Without you, I will not be able to do everything that I need to do for Germany, blah, blah, blah." So the point is that that's what he sort of saw as his major, what he was doing. He was working for Germany, and everything kind of had to be fit into that story. Very self-serving, but nonetheless interesting. The other answer to the question of why Greiser did what he did lies in his very specific biography. Greiser turns out to have been really quite insecure as a Nazi. He always felt that he had to be radical in order to shore up his Nazi credentials. In part, this has to do with the fact that he came to the Nazis very late, only in 1929, which is quite late for a high-ranking Nazi. Elements of his biography didn't look good to the Nazis. He'd been a Freemason in the 1920s. I never mentioned that he fought in World War I and ultimately was a combat pilot, but he was shot down very early on in his missions, and so there's some question of how stellar his war record really was, even though later on he touted that up a great deal. During the interwar period and when he became a Nazi of some prominence, he was in Danzig, where he eventually became chief executive of the city, although not the Nazi party leader. He was always the deputy party leader there. And he had a terrible rivalry during that period with the man who actually was the Nazi territorial leader in Danzig. And as a result, Greiser, at that time in his career, actually took on some fairly moderate positions. And I think that once he got to the Warthegau, he really felt like he had to live that down. He had to live down that moderation. Also, the fact that Greiser was not a very long-standing party member meant that he didn't have a particularly close relationship with Hitler, and so he needed to find other patrons in Berlin. And Heinrich Himmler, who's the one in charge of all this sort of demographic reordering, was the right man for Greiser as a patron. All right, what happened to Greiser? In January of 1945, Greiser left the area of the Warthegau in advance of Soviet troops. In May of 1945, the Americans captured him. They extradited him to Poland in March of 1946. There, Greiser was put on trial and sentenced to death. Interestingly, he was the first man ever convicted of crimes against the peace, that is, the Nuremberg charge. The Nuremberg trials were going on just as Greiser's trial was going on. The Polish jurists putting him on trial knew all about Nuremberg and structured their indictment rather like the Nuremberg indictments. And so that's how it is that Greiser became the first man ever convicted of crimes against the peace. The Polish jurists were very cautious and didn't quite charge him with crimes against humanity. They had a slightly different formulation, so I can't claim that Greiser was the first man ever convicted of crimes against humanity. Greiser was hanged on July 21st, 1946. 15,000 people came to the hanging. It was a front-page story in the New York Times. Finally, how do I know all this stuff about Greiser? Greiser actually left quite a paper trail. He wrote a lot of letters home during World War I as a soldier. He wrote all these love letters to his mistress. He left tons and tons of documents in Posen because when the Germans fled, there wasn't enough time to leave. But then, interestingly, I always knew Greiser had 3 children. I knew that one was dead through a car accident in the Warthegau. I knew that there were 2 daughters, and I knew that there was no way I'd ever be able to find them because they would have married, obviously, presumably, and there are plenty of Greisers, so I couldn't start contacting every Greiser in Germany. And all of a sudden, one day, an email message popped up on my screen and said, Katrin Greiser, and from Katrin Greiser. And it turned out that Greiser family members contacted me. And so as a result, I've interviewed the one surviving daughter several times. You might be interested to know that the first thing she said to me was, "You're going to write about the good my father did, right?" And so my response to her was, well, you know, what was the good your father did? And she said, well, he helped some Jews leave Danzig in the 1930s. And, of course, the response to that is, at the time when the Jews were forced out of Danzig in 1938, it was considered absolutely obscene, horrible that this could happen to Jews. And it was only later that that turns out to be, or seems to be, a relatively humane policy, you know, forcing the Jews out. So that's where I am. Are there any questions? Yeah?
You mentioned a couple examples where he deferred to Himmler. Can you cite a couple of dramatic ones where he independently took action? Okay,
so you're raising the issue of how much power did Greiser really have? Greiser was remarkably powerful. This had to do with the fact that he was a Gauleiter in an eastern area. Hitler had made it quite clear that he wanted this area Germanized within 10 years. He didn't care quite how it happened. And as a result, Greiser took the cue and basically thwarted all Berlin ministerial interference. He, just ignored when, messages came from the Interior Ministry. He just ignored them or said, no, I'm not going to do this. Same thing with the Church Ministry and all different other ministries. There were times when Greiser really challenged Himmler. There were things that Himmler was doing that Greiser didn't think was right from his perspective, and he told him so. So he actually had quite a backbone as concerned Himmler. But there were also times when he just gave in, because I think he realized lost cause wasn't going to work. But the broader point that I am making in the book is that these Nazi territorial chieftains were really quite powerful, and again, particularly in the East. And then the question becomes, were they setting up a model for the future of Nazi Germany where territorial leaders, according to the so-called leadership principle, would really be in charge, which is very much what Hitler actually envisioned. I mean, Hitler did not envision a centralized state. He envisioned a Germany of different Gaus with very strong leaders who would do, their Gau's identity would be linked with those leaders' identities, just as Germany as a whole was linked with Hitler. Yeah?
During the early period that you're discussing, it was the Russians who committed so many atrocities against the Poles. Is there any relationship between what they were doing and what Greiser was doing?
As far as the Poles are concerned, yes, the relationship was they live between two enemies who want to eradicate them. And so for the Poles, it was not necessarily better to be with the Russians or to be with the Germans. They were both sort of awful possibilities. There is not so much... I haven't seen so many connections of sort of Germans looking at exactly what the Soviets are doing. I mean, there seems to be a repertoire sort of ethnic cleansing processes that are going on in, Europe at this time. So I don't think that one was more innovative than the other or anything along those lines. But the Poles were shafted. There's no question between, the Germans and the Russians at this time. Yeah?
Was the Polish underground very active in Western?
The Polish underground was not particularly active in Greiser's Gau. It was really pretty draconian, and the discrimination against the Poles was sufficiently severe, and the punishments that were meted out to the Polish resistance members who were caught were sufficiently severe so that, they were constantly rounded up. It was relatively futile. There were a few cases of sabotage of train lines. Some cases, I think the Poles managed to poison some important Nazis in the Gau, a few things like that. But on the whole, this was not an area that saw a lot of resistance, largely because the Gestapo and other security officials simply cracked down very, very quickly. It's not like the general government where there are, whole Polish universities and a whole Polish underground that is flourishing. It's not like that in the Warthegau at all. Yeah? Oh, excuse me, yeah.
What was the daughter's explanation? The daughter's explanation of why he joined the party in 1929 when Hitler's opinions were well known in Mein Kampf from the years before. I mean, what was the reason for that? This was prior to the Nazi Party taking over the country.
Right. I mean, her reasoning would have been, first of all, the daughter has spent her entire life trying not to figure out what her father did. So she has spent all her psychic energy, much of her psychic energy trying to not find out what her father did. She would have said her father joined the Nazi Party because he had no idea where the Nazi Party was going to go. Had he ever had the slightest indication that, it was going to be genocide and ethnic cleansing on this scale, he would never have joined, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. She has a vision of her father, obviously, as a good man, and her post-war dream was always that her father would come knocking at the door and, sort of come home. And it's her father. He was a good father. Just a little bit of ethnic. No, not even a little bit. She would not have thought that that's why he joined. Yeah.
What's happened today to that area? Is that part of Poland?
That is all part of Poland. The Poles are, in fact, the best ethnic cleansers of all. They managed to get rid of the German population once and for all from that area, and that is now, it's a very Polish area. There's very little German influence. I mean, you can still see it in architecture and that sort of thing, but it is, it's very much Polish, and the Germans, except for a few on the sort of radical right, have given up all claims to that area. Yeah.
In your research, have you found a reasonable number of people who did know Greiser, who worked with him, who are still alive?
Yes, I have. It turns out that Greiser's roughly 95-year-old cousin, who was also his personal advisor in Posen, is still alive. I talked to that man. I also talked to the man who was his adjutant in 1945. These guys, I suspect, know more than they're willing to say. They talk very nicely about Greiser and his personality and everything like that. They say very little about any crimes that Greiser might have committed, largely because they know themselves that they were part of that, and one of them in particular, there's some question about whether he really should be brought to trial one of these days. There's always a dilemma of interviewing these people. You sort of leave and you want to hold your nose. But on the other hand, they're very, you want to get the flavor of these people and the flavor of what they say about Greiser. So I found it useful interviewing them. Yeah?
Do you think there's any learning going on, meaning as you, with last name that you have interviewing these Nazis, do you think there was any pushback or feedback, or did you feel any discomfort?
I didn't feel particular discomfort. The biggest, sort of the main time when my whatever self came up was when I was interviewing a German who'd grown up in this area and who himself has written some books about the area. And we were questioning some detail about Posen, and he just decided to call up his friend, his Polish friend in Posen. And he got on the phone and he said, well, this researcher, Catherine Epstein, is here. And on the other line, the guy said, well, Epstein, that's a Jewish name. And then the German basically said, yeah, so what? Can you help us with this question? So obviously the issue was more for the Polish guy that he was calling than for the Germans themselves. I mean, many Germans and Greisers' relatives in particular are very much, the sort of good Germans. They think what the Nazis did was horrible and so on and so forth. And that's partly, I think, why they've also supported me in this research. I mean, the daughter who doesn't want to know what her father has done has been very good about showing me some documents. She doesn't have that much in terms of documents, but very good in terms of showing me photographs, sharing photographs, everything like that. So they're on the side of sort of wanting to help out. Way in the back. Okay, so how did I happen to write this book? I got interested, well, my first book was on longtime East German communists, and I decided after I finished that book that I couldn't bear to spend 30 years or the next 30 years in East German archives, so I was looking for something else. I then got intrigued by all the material that was coming out on ethnic cleansing, and I decided to take an area where there had been waves of ethnic cleansing and to sort of study the escalation of that ethnic cleansing. And so then I came to this area, Posen, and through various, ways and sort of serendipitous happenings, came across Greiser, whose biography actually spans the sort of period of ethnic cleansing, because, of course, he was there as a child when it was a German area. He had to leave after World War I. He came back in and did all this ethnic cleansing as a Nazi. And then after 1945, all the Germans, of course, had to leave. Yep.
About the Russians, there must have been quite a lot of excitement when they moved in.
When
the Germans out. Now, did you use Russian sources? Did they cooperate?
I didn't need to use Russian sources. I've used quite a few Polish sources, but what's interesting is that when the Russians came in, they came to a town in the eastern part of the Warthegau. They heard that a person named Greiser was there and immediately shot him. And that person was actually Greiser's brother. Greiser had brought a bunch of his relatives to the Warthegau. So the Russians knew about Greiser. They thought they'd gotten the right guy. They just murdered him right flat out. Greiser learned about that really within 24 hours, but was out and quickly made his way into Germany so that the same fate would not befall him. Yeah?
Are you familiar with Browning's Ordinary Men?
Absolutely.
Was it the same area?
Was that the same area? The Reserve Police Battalion 101 does spend a little bit of time in Posen before they go on to commit all of their massacres. So when they are in the Posen area, they are involved with rounding up various Poles for deportation, but they're not yet engaged in kind of genocidal actions against Jews as they are a couple of years later. But they do get some practice in rounding up in this area. But the main part of that book takes place further east. Yeah.
I just have to say, I think anybody who's taking your courses is very lucky.